Okay, when we left off last time we were looking at the person list, and I think the problem we had with the lister then was sorting wasn't working. I've since fixed that, so the sorting is now working properly. We can turn the page or make it page a little more, and then we can see that the sorting is still correct even when you're paging through it, so that's very important. Okay, alright, let's put it back to where we can see the records. There we go, and we'll put it back to sort over here. And okay, so now let's talk a little bit about, so the way we fixed that was I've just recently refactored this entire pager stuff so that it can support multiple pagers and pagers that have searchable paging, and made it into a proper factory. So I'm still working out some issues with that. So what I wasn't doing there was checking to see if there was a sort criteria specified already, and if there wasn't, then plug in our default, as opposed to the code before I wasn't checking and just plugging in a default. That's why it always was sorting on the same field. So so far I think that's probably the only issue left with the pager that's been completely redone. So so let's get to our list. Okay, so we were going through the Struts JQuery plugin for the grid, and I went through all the fields and how they're set up. What we're going to look at now is actually what's going on in the background here. So actually when we bring up the page, of course our list is running, and here we're getting our factory. So we're getting a JQuery pager factory. From the factory we're getting a JQuery pager, and we're telling it to run the criteria, and getting back running the actual Hibernate query based on the criteria that we get from our request attributes for this particular pager type. I think we looked at that in one of the previous videos. So now that we have all the variables back, we can set the total number of records, and we can get the records, we can get the total number of records and the total number of pages, so that we know how many pages we're going to have to paginate through, or the JQuery pager needs to know that. And then we send them back, and the pager of course iterates through them and creates our nice table. Then now when we edit or create a new record there, we have some of these JavaScript functions we want to run. Okay, so before we actually submit the record, we're setting the person model. So what we're doing here is we're getting the fields from the actual record before we submit the record, and creating the model. The problem is that the grid doesn't allow you to specify person dot last name, person dot first name, and I was finding that I had to create setters and stuff for all that, and that just wouldn't work. So in most cases the way I'm working these is that, well, let's take a look at it. So here, there's only a few fields. I don't want to have every field in the person record show up. In this case there is only 3 fields, but you could have a situation where you could have of course address information and various contact information and phone numbers and other things, and you wouldn't want to have that all in the same grid and try to edit all of that at once. It would just be a little much. So the way I do it is I create the minimal amount of data for the list and make it searchable, and then people can find the records they want easily. They can quickly add records through the grid using just the minimum required fields, and then they can go back and edit. So so let's see, let's take a look at one at what happens when we do that. So let's create a new record, and we'll put in a invalid email address, and you'll see. Okay, so we're getting an invalid email, and we know why. Now if we put in a valid email, and that's basically from a custom message. So if we put in a valid email, now the record gets submitted, and you can add as many as you want here real quick, and you see in the background it refreshed, and that's because of the option we turned on to refresh after submit. Okay, and that's what's happening here. So after submit, we're going to reload the grid. Before we submit, we're setting the person model. So as soon as we hit the submit button, this function ran and then copied our post data into and created new values for the post data so that the model would get populated. And then after the submit, we're calling something called check grid options, which is basically checking the value that we're sending back from our action class that tells us the record was valid or invalid. So if we go and look at our action now, we see that it was calling the grid edit person when we clicked submit. So if we go to grid edit person, which is here, we can see that we're not supporting a delete. Okay, if we were supporting a delete in the grid, there would be a trash can here, and we can turn that on by using one of the options in the list for the grid right here. So we see we have our navigator delete turned off. If we turn that on, the trash can would show up, and then that when we ran the set person model, or actually when this got submitted, we would have the delete function set on. But we're not doing deletes, so we're sending back that message. So you would get that custom error message in that form saying delete not supported, assuming that this should never happen. Okay, in this case we got an add or an edit. We're also not allowing edits, but you could turn that on if you want, and it would cause a pencil to show up in the grid over here. So, and we'll see that as we go into the App Manager application. It's using a lot of those advanced features. Like I said, right now we're just trying to keep it simple. So let's look at the code here. So when we add a record, we're calling the validate person, and validate person is running, and then it's checking for duplicate email, and we saw you get a duplicate. And here we got an invalid email from our Commons Apache validator, and that sent back the message. Now what we're doing here is, if we get an error message back and we don't get success, we're setting the grid operation message. Okay, and in our struts class, when we get the error back, so you see here, after we call grid edit person, we get back this message. And when we check it in our person list after we submit, we're checking to see if we're getting person saved. If it wasn't saved, then we got an error, and then we return the custom message, and this is the message that shows up on that form that we edited. So if we go back to the form and click plus, let's do and we'll put in a duplicate email.